Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I went camping a few weeks back, deep in the Appalachians. I'd heard rumors of strange things in these woods, stories about creatures that didn't belong here. But I was raised not to believe in that stuff, so I didn't give it much thought. My girlfriend Claire and I were just looking to disconnect from the world, to escape into nature for a few nights and enjoy the peace and quiet. Little did we know that this trip would turn into the most horrifying experience of our lives. We arrived at the trailhead around noon, and after a long hike, we finally found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was isolated, miles away from the nearest trail, and blanketed by towering trees. Their gnarled roots twisted out of the ground like the fingers of something buried beneath. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. We pitched our tent, gathered firewood, and settled in as the sun dipped below the horizon. That first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, stargazed, and shared stories. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, but as we lay in our tent, the silence outside began to feel oppressive. I kept hearing these faint scratching noises, like something was moving just outside the tent. I chalked it up to raccoons or maybe a fox, but it still made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep. The next day, we explored the area. We found a small creek nearby and decided to follow it upstream. Claire wandered ahead while I took pictures capturing the beauty of the forest. I stopped to get a shot of a fallen tree, its roots exposed like the ribs of some ancient beast when I heard her call out. Her voice was strained, almost panicked. I ran toward her voice and found her standing by a clearing, staring at something in the underbrush. There were these strange, twisted symbols carved into the trees, spirals, eyes, and figures that looked almost human but not quite right. They were crude, yet each one seemed intentional, like a warning. Claire wanted to go back to camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt hostile, as if it resented our presence. We made our way back in silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just out of sight. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. When we got back to the campsite, I was exhausted, but Claire was worse. She was trembling, barely speaking. I tried to comfort her, but I couldn't shake the dread that had settled into my bones. That night, we heard something outside the tent. It started as a low growl, then turned into a guttural snarl that seemed to circle around us, close but not too close. We clutched each other, hardly daring to breathe. Then there was a scratching sound like claws against fabric right against the tent wall. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out, but I couldn't see anything, just shadows, endless shadows that seemed to dance around us. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement, something big and fast. I only caught a glimpse, a pair of glowing eyes, tall, hunched figure, covered in matted fur. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Was it a bear? A wolf? But those eyes, they were too intelligent, too aware. Whatever it wasn't a normal animal. The thing snarled again, and we heard it crash away through the underbrush, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, listening, waiting. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and started the trek back, but the forest felt different, like it was watching us, waiting for us to leave. On the hike back, we got turned around somehow. I checked the map, but nothing made sense. Paths we'd walked the day before seemed to lead to places we hadn't seen before, as if the forest was rearranging itself, trapping us in some twisted labyrinth. We started to panic, and that's when we heard it, a low, mournful howl that echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of something crashing through the brush toward us. We ran, branches whipped against our faces and roots seemed to reach up, tripping us, slowing us down. I could hear something behind us, getting closer. My legs burned, but fear drove me forward. Eventually, we burst out into a clearing. There was a cabin there, decrepit and overgrown, as if it had been abandoned for years. Desperate, we ducked inside, slamming the door behind us. It was dark, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around. The walls were covered in those same symbols we'd seen before, only these were fresher, like they'd been carved just recently. And there were bones scattered everywhere. Small ones, large ones, some that looked disturbingly human. Claire backed into a corner, staring at something on the far wall. I turned the flashlight, and there it was, a crude painting of a creature, tall and hunched, with glowing eyes and a mouthful of jagged teeth. Beneath it, scrawled in blood-red paint, were the words, "It sees you." Before we could react, we heard the door creak open behind us. I turned, and there, silhouetted in the doorway, was the thing from the woods. It was taller than I remembered, with those same glowing eyes. It stepped inside, and I realized with a sickening dread that it was smiling, as if it recognized us, as if it had been waiting for us all along. The last thing I remember is its eyes, burning into me as it moved closer, the room closing in, and the feeling of claws digging into my shoulders. I woke up back at the trailhead, disoriented and alone. There was no sign of Claire, no sign of our camp, just the forest stretching out around me like a trap. I stumbled to my car, drove straight home, and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees outside my window. I haven't seen Claire since that day. Part of me hopes she made it out, but deep down, I know the truth. The forest took her, and one day, it's going to come back for me too. I love camping, at least I used to. There's something about being out there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the endless dark of the forest, that feels like freedom. Or at least, it did. Before last summer, I was on one of my usual solo trips up in the Adirondacks, a place I know like the back of my hand. It's about as deep in the woods as you can get in New York without crossing into Canada. No cell signal, no lights, just you, the trees, and whatever else is out there. That's always been the appeal for me, disconnecting. But that trip was different. That trip ruined camping for me. I remember that night so clearly, it's like I'm still there. It was just before dusk, and I'd been hiking all day, trying to reach this spot I'd found on an old map. Some place that the park rangers either didn't know about or didn't want people to know about. It was called Dead Man's Hollow. I know, pretty cliche, right? But I figured it'd be the perfect place to camp without any disturbances. The hike in was uneventful. The forest was quiet, just the sounds of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional bird overhead. Peaceful even. I set up camp in a small clearing just as the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky turning from blue to a bruised purple. By the time I got my fire going, the woods around me were swallowed by darkness. And that's when I noticed how silent everything was. No crickets, no rustling in the underbrush, just stillness. It should have been my first warning. I was cooking a freeze-dried meal over the fire when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. The sound came from just beyond the firelight, deep in the blackness of the trees. It sounded like a dog, but bigger, much bigger and meaner. My first thought was bear, so I grabbed the small hatchet I kept by my side and stood up slowly, scanning the woods. I called out, "Hey, go on, get." My voice sounded much smaller than I'd expected it to, like the trees were swallowing it. The growl stopped, but I could feel something watching me. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just my nerves. I sat back down, finished my meal in silence, and crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of laughter. It was soft, like a child trying not to be heard, and it was circling my tent. I froze. I didn't know what to do. That kind of laughter doesn't belong out there, not in the deep woods, and it was getting closer. I reached for my hatchet, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle tight, my ears straining to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It felt like hours before it stopped, the silence hitting me like a punch to the gut. And then something dragged its fingers, its claws down the side of my tent, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. I shot out of the tent, swinging the hatchet wildly, my voice hoarse as I screamed at the empty forest. But there was nothing there, no footprints, no sign of an animal, just the dying embers of my campfire and my own panicked breaths in the cold night air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, staring into the darkness, gripping my hatchet like it was my lifeline. The forest stayed quiet, but every so often I'd hear something moving just beyond the tree line, something heavy like it was pacing, waiting for what? I didn't know. As soon as the sun broke over the horizon, I packed up and left. I kept my head down, walked fast, and didn't look back. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me. I'd hear branches snap to my left, and when I'd turn, nothing was there. Then a few minutes later, it'd be on my right, and I'd catch the faintest glimpse of something, just a flash of gray fur, or maybe skin. It was hard to tell. But it was always gone before I could get a good look. I made it to my truck by noon, and I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel it. The eyes, watching me, following me. That should have been the end of it. I should have left whatever it was out there in the woods, and I almost convinced myself that's what happened. But about a week after I got home, things started happening around my house. I'd wake up to find scratches on my front door, long and deep, like something had tried to claw its way inside. At night, I'd hear that same low growl from outside my window, and sometimes that laughter. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But last night something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the sounds outside, those same soft laughs and heavy footsteps. But then I heard my back door creak open. I locked it. I know I did. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but I couldn't get a signal. It felt like the woods all over again, like whatever had followed me had brought that deep silence with it, cutting me off from everything else. And then it spoke. A voice came from the shadows of my hallway, soft and hoarse, mimicking my own voice. Go on. Get. It was mocking me, repeating what I'd said in the woods, but distorted, like it was forcing the words through a mouth not made for human speech. And then laughter, louder this time, closer. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I ran out the front door and didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house. I banged on their door, screaming for help until they let me in. The cops came, of course, but they didn't find anything. No scratches, no open doors, nothing to prove I wasn't just crazy. I'm staying with a friend tonight, but I don't know if that'll help. Whatever it is, it followed me out of those woods, and it won't let me go. I can hear it right now outside the window, pacing, waiting, and laughing. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from it. And if you hear laughter in the woods, don't run, don't speak, and whatever you do, don't look back. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend to disconnect, escape the grind, and breathe in the wilderness. Just me, my friend Ethan, and the untamed beauty of the dense Appalachian woods. We'd done this dozens of times, pitching our tent far off the beaten path, miles away from the nearest human being. It was what we lived for, until the night it all went wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, sunlight dappling through the thick canopy of trees as we found the perfect spot. A clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek running nearby. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the sounds of nature all around us. Rustling leaves, chirping birds, the distant gurgle of water. Everything felt perfect, like nature welcoming us in. The first odd thing happened while we were setting up camp. Ethan had wandered off to gather firewood, and I was hammering down the last tent peg when I heard something. A low, guttural sound, like an animal growl, but distorted. It echoed from deeper in the woods, just far enough that I couldn't place what kind of animal it could be. I paused, listening, but when the sound didn't repeat, I chalked it up to my imagination. These woods were known for their wildlife, after all. Ethan returned, arms full of branches, and I asked him if he'd heard anything strange. He gave me a strange look and shook his head, dismissing it as forest noises. But even then, there was something in his eyes. Maybe he had heard it but didn't want to admit it. The sun dipped lower, and we settled in around the fire, cooking our dinner and swapping stories as the sky bled into darkness. The woods were quiet now, unusually so. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs seemed absent, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The only sound was the crackling of our fire. I tried not to think too much about it, but my nerves were on edge. I could see it in Ethan, too, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with unease. Every now and then we'd both glance into the shadows beyond the firelight, like we were expecting something to be out there. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire couldn't keep the cold at bay, and a thick fog began to roll in from the creek, swallowing the surrounding trees. It was then that we heard the footsteps, soft but deliberate, just beyond our campsite. Ethan shot me a look, and we both grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the trees. The beams of light cut through the fog, illuminating the underbrush, but there was nothing there. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart pounded as we both strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "I think we should pack up and leave," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. He wasn't the type to spook easily, but something had him rattled, and it was contagious. We stood, debating whether to take down the tent in the dark or just abandon it, when something moved at the edge of the clearing. Just a shadow at first, slipping between the trees. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was big, and it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. The way it slinked from tree to tree, hunched over, almost humanoid. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you see that?" Ethan muttered, eyes wide. Before I could answer, the growl came again. This time it was unmistakable, low and guttural but wrong, like multiple voices layered over each other. It reverberated through the trees, coming from all directions at once. We grabbed our packs, abandoning the tent, and started for the trail. As we stumbled through the dark, I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. No, stalked. Something was out there, pacing us, staying just out of sight but never far behind. We heard branches snap, leaves crunching underfoot, and every now and then that horrible growl. We broke into a full run. My breath came in ragged gasps as the fog thickened, making it hard to see. Ethan was just ahead of me, his flashlight flickering wildly. We were close to the trailhead, maybe a half-mile out, when Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. I slammed into him, almost knocking him over, and followed his gaze. There, in the middle of the trail, stood something. It was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally, with long, bony limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of Ethan's flashlight, yellow, like a predator's. And its face. It was like it was wearing a mask, a grotesque imitation of a human face, stretched tight over its skull but wrong in every way. Neither of us moved. We were frozen, paralyzed by the thing's gaze. It stood there, silent, watching us with an intelligence that felt far too human. Then slowly it tilted its head, and I heard a whisper, clear as day, but coming from all around us. "Run." We didn't need to be told twice. Ethan bolted, and I followed, my legs burning as we sprinted down the trail. The thing didn't chase us, not directly, but I could feel it, feel them. More than one now, watching from the trees, their eyes glowing in the dark, their growls echoing through the forest. We reached the car fumbling with the keys as the air around us seemed to hum with static. As we peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. Its head tilted again, that same twisted mockery of a human face, as if it was letting us go. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, deep into the next town. Neither of us spoke, too shaken to even process what had just happened. It wasn't until the next morning, when we checked the footage from the trail cam Ethan had set up at camp, that we saw it. The camera had caught movement around 2 a.m. just before we left. A figure, tall and lanky, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us sleep. Its face was Ethan's, but Ethan was right next to me. We never went back to those woods, and we never talk about what we saw, not anymore. Some things are better left forgotten, but sometimes in the dead of night I still hear that growl, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I never thought a simple camping trip would lead me here, to this moment where the very air feels wrong, thick with a presence I can't explain. My hands are trembling as I write this down, hoping someone will find it, hoping this serves as a warning. It started with a text from my old college buddy Sam. He was the adventurous one, always dragging me into his wild schemes. This time, it was a remote camping trip deep in the Blackwood Forest, far off the grid, where no cell service or tourist trails existed. The kind of place you hear urban legends about, whispers of strange creatures, of people going missing. I should have said no, but I didn't. We left on a Friday, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The road grew rougher the farther we went, until it wasn't much of a road anymore, just a narrow, twisting dirt path cutting through the dense trees. By the time we reached the spot Sam had picked, it was dusk, the light fading quickly. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful, calming kind, but an unnatural silence that settled over the woods like a blanket. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just nothing. I told Sam about it, but he waved it off like always, saying we were just deeper into nature than we were used to. We set up camp by a small clearing, the trees towering around us, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead. There was no moon that night, just a thick darkness that swallowed everything. Sam made a fire, and we sat around it drinking beer and swapping stories about work, life, everything except the gnawing feeling growing inside me. Something wasn't right. Around midnight, as the fire flickered low, that's when I heard it. A faint sound in the distance, like someone calling for help. It was so far off, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter, trying to focus on the sound. Sam shrugged. "Probably just an animal." "No," I insisted. "It sounded like a voice." The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, a woman's voice, crying out from deep in the woods. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The cry wasn't frantic, but desperate, like someone pleading for help. Sam noticed the change in my expression and grabbed his flashlight. "You're really freaked out, huh?" he said, trying to sound casual, but with a slight edge in his voice. "I'll go check it out. Stay here." "Wait, are you serious, Sam? It's the middle of the night. We don't know these woods." He flashed a grin at me, the firelight casting eerie shadows across his face. "Relax. I won't go far. Just gonna see if it's someone lost or messing around." Before I could argue, he disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight bouncing between the trunks. I sat there, listening as his footsteps grew quieter, until they vanished completely. Then the silence returned, thick, suffocating. I waited, watching the fire die down to embers, the cold night air creeping in around me. Sam didn't come back. I checked my watch. 15 minutes, 20, 30. Nothing. That's when I heard it again. The woman's voice, closer this time, clearer. "Help me." I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my heart pounding. The voice was wrong. It wasn't just that it was closer. It sounded off. The tone was too even, too calm for someone in danger. It echoed around the trees, as if the forest itself was mocking me. "Sam," I shouted, shining my flashlight into the trees. No response. "Sam, if you're messing with me, it's not funny." The voice came again, from my left this time.
"Help me!"
I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the endless dark. I turned around, scanning the other side of the camp, and that's when I saw something. A figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. "Sam?" I called again, my voice shaking. But it wasn't Sam. The figure was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, too twisted. It was standing unnaturally still, facing me, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a vague, distorted silhouette. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping forward into the dim glow of the dying fire. And that's when I saw it. Its face. It wasn't a face. Not really. It was a grotesque mask of skin, stretched too tight. The eyes hollow and black, the mouth wide and smiling. But the smile didn't reach its eyes. They were empty. Dead. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't listen. The thing took another step closer, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me. And then, in that same distorted, too calm voice, it spoke. "Help me." The voice didn't match its mouth. The words came out, but the lips didn't move. They just hung there, twisted in that horrible smile. I turned and bolted, sprinting blindly into the woods, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The voice followed me, though, growing fainter, but always just behind me. "Help me, help me." I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I kept going until finally, mercifully, I saw the road. I stumbled onto it, collapsing in a heap, gasping for air. I looked back, expecting to see the thing standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark woods, silent and still, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Sam was never found. Search teams combed the area for days, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no belongings. It was like he vanished into thin air. They said he must have gotten lost in the forest, maybe fell into a ravine, but I know the truth. I know what I saw. I left the town a few days later, but I can't stop hearing it. Every night as I lay in bed, I hear that voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." And every night it gets closer. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much time I have left. The ranger said he'd return by morning, but the sun hasn't risen yet, and I can't stay awake much longer. I'm holed up in this old ranger station, the last shelter before the deep woods swallows you whole. But I need to tell someone what happened before it finds me. It started like a regular camping trip, me and my buddy Kyle, two city guys looking for a break from the noise. We'd planned this for months, a weekend in the untouched wilderness of Black Pine National Park. It was far from any main roads, the kind of place where you could disappear for a while. That's what we wanted. To feel small again, like the world wasn't closing in on us. We parked the truck at the trailhead, strapped on our packs, and began the hike to an old campsite Kyle found on some obscure hiker's forum. The ranger we met at the visitor center had given us an odd look when we mentioned where we were headed. "People don't go up there anymore," he said, scratching his beard. His name tag read Collins. He had that hardened look, like a man who'd seen too much of these woods. "They say things. Change up there." "What do you mean?" Kyle asked with a laugh, not taking him seriously. Collins hesitated. "Strange sounds, animals acting weird. I've been around here long enough to know the difference between a bear and something else. People report seeing things, shapes, shadows, sometimes more." I brushed it off as local legend, just another campfire story to scare the tourists. We were experienced hikers, prepared for a weekend in the woods. What did we have to worry about? By the time we made camp, the sun was beginning to set behind the treetops. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. We set up our tents, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. The first sign something was off came around midnight. I'd stepped away from the fire to take a leak and had just zipped up my pants when I noticed it. Everything had gone silent. Not the natural quiet of a sleeping forest, but an unnatural, suffocating stillness. No wind, no bugs, no movement, just silence. I turned back toward the campfire and froze. Kyle was still sitting by the fire, but something was wrong. His posture was rigid, head cocked slightly to the side like he was listening for something. His back was to me, but I could tell something was off. "Kyle?" I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't respond. He just sat there perfectly still, staring into the flames. I took a step closer, heart pounding. "Kyle, are you okay?" Suddenly, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, his head twisted further toward his shoulder, too far for it to be natural. My breath caught in my throat as he turned to face me. It wasn't Kyle. It looked like him, sure, but the eyes, those empty black eyes, told me it wasn't him. They gleamed in the firelight, too wide, too focused. The mouth twisted into a smile, but the skin around it stretched unnaturally, as though the face wasn't meant to hold that expression. A voice came from its mouth, but it was wrong. It was Kyle's voice, but hollow, as though someone were repeating words they didn't understand. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. I backed away, nearly tripping over a tree root. My mind raced. Where was Kyle? What was this thing? It stood up slowly, deliberately. I realized then that its movements were all wrong, too smooth, like a predator sizing up its prey. Panicking, I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at my face, feet stumbling over rocks and roots. The moon was high, casting just enough light to see the faint outline of the trail. I didn't stop until I found the old ranger station, barely visible through the thick trees. The door was unlocked and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I looked out through the cracked window, panting, trying to listen for footsteps. But all I heard was that terrible silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it's hard to tell. The ranger station was small, barely more than a single room with a few shelves and an old radio. I tried to use it, but there was nothing but static. My phone had no signal, of course. Then the knock came. At first it was soft, barely audible over my own breathing. A single, deliberate knock on the door. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Another knock, louder this time. Then a voice. Kyle's voice. "Hey man, open up, it's me, let me in." It was him, Kyle, outside the door, but something was wrong with his tone. Too eager, too flat. I stayed silent, my hands gripping the edge of the table in the middle of the room. The knocking stopped for a moment, then the voice came again. "I'm cold, man, let me in, please." It was the same tone, the same repetition of words, like it was trying to remember how to ask, how to sound human. I backed away from the door. Then came the scratching, soft at first, then more insistent, like something dragging its nails down the wood. I could hear the thing breathing now, heavy, labored breaths as it scratched at the door. The voice came again, this time more forceful. "Let me in." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I knew, somehow I knew, that whatever was out there, it wasn't Kyle. The scratching stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was silent again. I dared to hope it had left. And then, from behind me, I heard the door to the back room creak open. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Kyle, or what used to be Kyle. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes too large for his face, black and gleaming in the dim light. His mouth opened, and that same hollow, inhuman voice came out. "You shouldn't have come here." I ran, I don't even remember grabbing my pack, just the blind panic that gripped me as I bolted out of the station and back into the woods. The thing that looked like Kyle didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching, that twisted grin never leaving its face. I've been hiding in the woods ever since, moving from place to place, trying to stay ahead of whatever it is that stalks me. But I can feel it out there, always just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. The ranger, he never came back. But sometimes at night I hear his voice. I've worked as a park ranger for the last 12 years, mostly in small remote areas where tourists rarely venture. But recently, I got transferred to Red Creek National Park, a place with an unsettling reputation. People talk about the area like it's cursed. Whispered stories of strange disappearances, eerie sounds at night, and sightings of things that don't belong in any normal forest. It didn't bother me at first. I'm a rational guy. I don't buy into ghost stories. And I've been in the woods long enough to know that people's imaginations run wild when they're alone out here. But I wasn't prepared for what I'd experienced during my first week at Red Creek. The park is thick with towering pines, their branches intertwining overhead like a living roof that blocks out the sky. It's beautiful, but there's something claustrophobic about it. The silence is almost oppressive. No birds, no animals, just the sound of your own breathing and the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot. It's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're intruding on something ancient. On my third night, I was assigned to patrol the northern perimeter near Dead Man's Bluff, a cliffside that plunges straight down into a deep gorge. The place got its name from an old legend about a hiker who went missing there years ago. They never found his body. People say he still roams the woods, lost, calling for help in the dead of night. I left the ranger station just before dusk, radio in hand, flashlight clipped to my belt. The hike out to the bluff was about an hour, mostly through dense forest. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, the temperature dropped and the shadows stretched longer, turning the forest into a maze of shifting darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering sound carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the pines, but the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It wasn't random. It was like voices. Multiple voices whispering in unison, too low for me to make out the words. I stopped, scanning the trees around me. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest and the creeping darkness. But the whispering continued, just on the edge of my hearing, like it was coming from all directions at once. A chill ran down my spine and I picked up the pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As I neared Dead Man's Bluff, the whispering faded, replaced by a different sound. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't mine. I froze, listening. The footsteps were coming from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No response. Just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight. I shined the beam into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the gnarled trunks of the pines and the thick underbrush. But the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was thick, heavy, like the entire forest was holding its breath along with me. And then, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible voice. Close enough to make my blood run cold. "Help me." It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was there. Someone, or something, was out there, calling to me. But there was no one in sight, just the trees, looming like silent sentinels in the fading light. I should have turned back right then. I should have radioed for backup, reported the strange noises, and gone back to the safety of the ranger station. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had heard the stories about Dead Man's Bluff, needed to know what was out there. I continued on, my steps quicker now, my eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to shift with every movement. The bluff was just ahead, the edge of the cliff visible through a break in the trees. I approached cautiously, my pulse pounding in my ears. The moment I reached the cliff's edge, everything went still. The wind stopped. the whispering ceased, and the forest fell into an unnatural silence. The gorge below was a black void, impossible to see into with the growing darkness, but I didn't need to see it to feel the weight of something watching me. That's when I heard the voice again. "Help me." It was louder this time, clearer, as if the speaker was standing right next to me. My heart pounded, and I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly into the trees. And there, standing just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, and his eyes. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared straight through me. He stood motionless, lips barely moving as the same phrase repeated over and over. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rocks at the cliff's edge. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally fast, closing the distance between us in an instant, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispering returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices surrounding me, suffocating me. Panic surged through me. I bolted, running blindly through the trees, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The voices followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me! Help me!" I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, panting, my chest tight with fear. I threw myself inside, locking the doors, and sat there, shaking, listening to the pounding of my heart. The voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I drove back to the station as fast as the narrow, winding road would allow. When I finally got there, I sat in the truck for a long time, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me to take a few days off if I needed them. But as I left his office, he gave me a look that told me he knew exactly what I'd encountered. I never went back to Dead Man's Bluff after that night. I couldn't. But sometimes when I'm out in the park, I still hear it. That soft, haunting whisper. "Help me." And I know, whatever is out there, it's still waiting, still watching. But I won't be going back. Not ever. I'd always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. There's a certain kind of peace that only exists when you're miles away from anyone else. No buzzing phones, no exhaust fumes, just the quiet hum of nature. So when I heard about Bear Trap Valley, a remote stretch of woods known for its untouched beauty and rare wildlife, I packed my gear and set off for a solo trip. I wanted to be somewhere isolated, where I could listen to the trees and watch the stars. I got exactly what I wanted, and much, much more. I reached the valley just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The trees were massive, towering giants with thick canopies that blotted out the sky. It felt like stepping into another world. I set up my tent by a small, clear stream and sat by the water, watching the light fade as the forest around me grew darker. That's when I noticed the silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that settled over the valley like a shroud. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just nerves. It didn't help that I'd heard a story about Bear Trap Valley before I came. A story about the Wendigo Man. Apparently, there'd been sightings of a strange creature lurking in these woods for years. Locals described it as half man, half beast, with eyes that glowed like embers and a face that looked like it had been torn apart and reassembled by something that didn't understand how humans worked. They said it stalked campers, luring them deeper into the woods until they were hopelessly lost. Some called it a skinwalker, others a dogman. But no matter what name they used, the message was always the same. If you saw him, it was already too late. I pushed the story from my mind, hoping that a good night's sleep would settle my nerves. But as the night crept in, I started hearing noises. Soft at first, just faint whispers that seemed to drift through the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, but then they grew louder, forming words almost like a chant. "Come closer." I sat bolt upright, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely cut through the shadows. The trees seemed to lean in as if they were listening too. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the trees. They were a sickly yellow, reflecting the light like a predator's, unblinking and fixed right on me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The eyes moved closer, and I could make out its shape. Hulking, twisted, with limbs that were far too long, bending in unnatural ways. It walked upright, but its gait was wrong, lurching forward like it was barely holding itself together. And then I saw its face. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, but parts of it were missing, revealing patches of muscle and bone. Its mouth was twisted into a hideous grin, too wide, like someone had cut it open and forced it to smile. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back, but then I heard a voice behind me. "Need some help finding your way back?" I whipped around to see another figure, a man in a park ranger's uniform, his face hidden in the shadows. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then I noticed something strange. His eyes were the same sickly yellow as the creature's, glowing in the darkness. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice hollow, echoing through the trees. "This place isn't safe, not for someone like you." He stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. His face. It was shifting, flickering like an old film reel, as if his skin was fighting to hold its shape. For a moment, I saw his true form, jagged teeth, twisted flesh, and eyes that burned with an unholy light. Then he blinked, and the ranger was back, smiling at me with a strange, knowing look. "Follow me," he said, and his smile widened, stretching far too wide for any human face. I stumbled back, turning to run, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, the shadows, the whispers, they all blurred together, twisting into a nightmare that wrapped itself around me like a noose. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my face and tearing at my clothes. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. The chanting grew louder, filling my head with a pulsing, rhythmic beat that made it hard to think. I could feel them closing in, their eyes like burning coals in the darkness, their twisted faces leering at me from every shadow. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing. I was gasping for breath, my legs trembling beneath me. I looked around, desperate for any sign of civilization, but all I saw were trees, and then I noticed something strange. A figure standing in the center of the clearing, perfectly still. It was me. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but there was no denying it. It was me, down to the smallest detail. My face, my clothes, even the gash on my cheek from where a branch had caught me. But my other self wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back at me with those same sickly yellow eyes. In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a monster hunting me. It was trying to become me, to take my place, my life, my memories. I took a step back, but my other self mirrored me, its face twisting into that same unnatural grin. "You'll make a fine addition," it whispered, its voice blending with mine, filling the clearing with an echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I ran, and this time I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, until I could see the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance. I scrambled into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove, never daring to look in the rearview mirror. Even now, as I sit here telling this story, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods, that when I looked into those yellow eyes, it took a piece of me, a piece that it's still holding on to, biding its time, waiting. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear I see a flicker of yellow just for a second. So if you ever find yourself in Bear Trap Valley and you see someone who looks like you, run, because the Wendigo Man doesn't just want your life. He wants your soul. And once he takes it, you'll be nothing but another twisted face, lost forever in the darkness of the woods. I used to love the wilderness. There was something about getting lost in the vast expanse of trees, hearing nothing but the wind rustling through the leaves, that made me feel free. My friends, Brian, Jess, and I, had been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend away from the noise and chaos of our lives deep in the forest, miles from civilization. We thought it was going to be the perfect escape. I wish we'd never gone. It started like any other trip. We drove for hours until the roads turned to dirt, then parked and hiked further until we were completely isolated. By the time we found a good clearing, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We set up camp, pitched our tents, and got a fire going. The night came quickly, and the darkness out there was heavy, the kind that makes it hard to see your hand in front of your face if you're too far from the fire. We sat around, talking and laughing, roasting marshmallows. It was perfect, until we heard the first noise. It was distant, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It echoed from deep in the forest, but none of us could pinpoint exactly where. I remember Jess looked at me, her face half lit by the fire, her eyes wide. "You guys heard that, right?" Brian shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of the woods. Relax." But it wasn't the kind of sound you could just shake off. It had a weight to it, something unnatural. Still, we all tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves that it was nothing. We kept talking, but our voices were quieter, our eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight more often than before. Then it happened again, louder this time, closer. Jess stood up, her hands gripping the sleeves of her jacket. "We should check it out," she said, her voice shaky. "What if it's something dangerous?" Brian, always the tough one, grabbed a flashlight. "Fine. I'll check it out. You two stay here." I didn't want to let him go alone. I grabbed my flashlight too and followed him, even though my gut was telling me to stay by the fire. The woods were silent, except for the crunching of leaves beneath our feet. The further we got from the campsite, the more oppressive the darkness became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and that strange noise hung in the air, like it was waiting for us. "Do you see anything?" I whispered. Brian swung his flashlight in wide arcs, lighting up the trees and bushes, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. My heart was racing, and I kept thinking about Jess, alone back at the camp. We didn't find anything. Reluctantly, we turned back. The silence between us more unsettling than anything we could have found. But when we got back to the clearing, Jess was gone. The fire had died down to embers, the faint glow barely enough to light the area. Her tent was still there, untouched. Her backpack sat by the fire, unzipped, but there was no sign of her. "Jess?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I called again, louder this time, but all I got in return was that same low growl from deep in the woods, closer than it had ever been. Brian looked at me, and I could tell by his face that he was starting to get scared too. "We need to find her," he said. "She wouldn't just leave like this." We grabbed more flashlights, calling her name over and over as we searched. The forest seemed endless, and every sound, every twig snapping, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were following us from the darkness just out of reach. Hours passed, no sign of Jess. We made our way back to the camp, exhausted and terrified, but as we approached, my heart sank. There were footprints, dozens of them, leading from the edge of the woods straight to the fire pit, and then disappearing, as if whoever or whatever made them had simply vanished. Brian knelt down, shining his flashlight on the prints. "These aren't hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're too big. Way too big." Suddenly we heard something, a soft rustling like someone moving through the trees. We both turned, shining our lights toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a shape barely visible between the trees. But then it moved, slowly stepping into the dim light of the dying fire. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were long, unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face— God, its face. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. Brian froze. I could barely breathe. It stood there watching us, or maybe not watching, since it didn't have eyes, just staring. And then it spoke, or at least it sounded like it was trying to. But the voice that came out wasn't its own. It was Jess's, her voice, pleading, terrified, echoing from that thing's mouth. "Help me, please." Brian took off running before I could stop him. He sprinted into the woods, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the darkness. I tried to follow, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, stuck in place, staring at that thing as it slowly started to walk toward me. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the ground near the dead fire. Brian was gone. Jess was gone. I was alone. The authorities searched the woods for days, but they never found them. No trace, no bodies. Just me, raving about monsters in the forest. They said it was shock, that I must have imagined it. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night I still hear that growl. I had always been drawn to places off the beaten path, the kind of wilderness where few people dared to go, where the land felt ancient and untouched. So when I heard about Black Hollow, a remote valley hidden deep within a forest preserve, I knew I had to go. There were rumors, of course. Locals in the nearby town wouldn't talk about it. Or if they did, they kept it vague. One old man at the gas station shook his head when I asked for directions, muttering something about bad air and things that don't belong. I laughed it off. I'd heard all kinds of stories about haunted forests and cursed places. It was just folklore, passed down to keep people away. That's what I told myself anyway. The hike into Black Hollow was long and difficult. The trails were barely visible, overgrown and twisted, like the forest was reclaiming the land. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind through the leaves, were absent. It wasn't dead quiet, though. There was a sound, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A low, distant hum, almost like wind, but it never changed. It stayed constant, as if it were coming from the earth itself. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already setting. Black Hollow was beautiful, I had to admit that. The trees were enormous, towering pines with roots that twisted and knotted above the ground. Moss clung to everything, a thick green carpet that muffled my footsteps. And yet, there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through something more than just fog. I set up camp in a small clearing, the fire casting flickering light across the trees as the last of the daylight faded. I tried to relax, to enjoy the solitude, but the feeling of being watched nagged at me. Every time I looked up from the fire, I found myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see something there. But there was nothing. Just shadows. As the night wore on, the hum I had heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't wind. I was sure of that now. It was more like a vibration, a deep thrumming that I could feel in my chest. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just some natural phenomenon I wasn't familiar with. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through me. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, trying to convince myself that it was just in my head. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. Footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They weren't far off, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, curious about the campfire, but the steps were too measured, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited. straining to hear anything over the low hum that seemed to fill the entire valley. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the persistent vibration. And then the footsteps started again, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, shining my light toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie quiet. No answer. The footsteps had stopped again, but I could feel something out there, just beyond the light. I stepped out of the tent, sweeping the flashlight around. The forest was still, too still. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, the light bobbing with my shaking hand. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, a shadow among shadows. But as I moved the light across it, the figure took shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was tilted, like it was listening. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, its hollow eyes staring right at me. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, it took a step forward. I backed up, nearly tripping over a root, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The figure took another step, its long legs moving awkwardly, like it wasn't used to walking. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as it moved closer, its head tilting further, like it was curious about me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel it vibrating through my bones, making my teeth chatter. The figure stood there, watching me, unmoving. And then, slowly, it raised one long, thin arm and pointed toward the woods. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and bolted back to my tent, grabbing only my backpack and the flashlight. I didn't bother with the rest of my gear. I didn't look back. The hike back to the car was a blur. The hum followed me the entire way, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the valley. But even when it faded completely, I could still feel it, a low vibration in the pit of my stomach. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the mountains. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw in Black Hollow. I don't know if it was real, or if the isolation and the strange energy of the place had gotten to me. But every time I think about going back to the woods, I hear that hum again. And I remember how it felt to be watched, to be pointed toward something I didn't want to see. I won't be camping alone anymore, not ever again.